a hard thing because we see it all the time in forums as far as people are like, oh, it only like I beat the thing in 4 hours and I dropped $20 on this. This is ridiculous. And other people find it for other reasons. I know for someone like myself, I'm really limited. I got a family and time. I got a family and all these other things going on. And hey, if it's a really good game and it only takes 4 hours, that's great because it's probably going to take me like several weeks before I can beat that game because of the time.
Yeah, I'd rather have a game leaving me wanting more than leave me like at the end. I'd rather play a game for 4 hours and say, oh, I want more, than play a game for 4 hours and say, oh my god, or 40 hours and say, oh my god, I just want to friggin' end.
Yeah. And Mustapha, what's your feelings about about the price point, whether it was discounted or not, and then the amount of hours you put into that game?
Yeah, so honest, I don't use per hour as like my justification for the cost of a game. And the reason I say that is because like the expectation of what a game does for you should really be based on what that experience is. For instance, Celeste, nominated Game of the Year.
Yep.
Not a very long experience, could probably be completed in its entirety within 4 to 5 hours. But as a whole, it's about kind of experiencing the narrative. There's collectibles scattered throughout, so it's got replay value. It really scales to what you get out of it, and it is a quality experience, so it is very much worth the cost. But if I were to, I guess, at the end of that 4 hours, be like, wow, that was an afternoon that I spent $20 on. I don't know that necessarily pans out. And then not to mention the fact, I mean, if you really think about, particularly talking about indie games, you're looking usually at the 20 or under price point for the most part. People would spend more on a traditional experience that they have within that same time frame.
Like going to the movies.
Right? Like you would have no problem perhaps spending $25 to go out and eat a 3-course meal or what have you. So I think we kind of scale it up because we're still thinking in terms of AAA, in terms of the 90s with Super Nintendo RPGs that are running you triple-digit time on how much you're spending on it. When that not only doesn't really suit the need of what gaming demographics are today, it's not particularly feasible for developers on the budgets and timeframes that they're on, and it's not always reflective of the purpose that a game is trying to serve in the first place. So I just don't know. I think there are too many variables for that to be a reasonable measurement.
I agree with you. And on the like what Andrew was saying in terms of you were saying time to put they put into the game, developing the game. I think that's a tough metric to price a game by as well, because you can put 10 years into something and it can be total garbage. Like if you're just not a good developer, then you can spend 10 years and make something totally mediocre and you charge $60 for it and no one's going to buy it. Or you could put a really talented team together and they could make a game in a weekend. Like there are game jams where that real published games have come out of, and
yeah, and that's a really good point. And it's, like I said, it's really subjective and stuff too, of course, because I think at some point there's going to be that threshold that you're going to go beyond. So if you took 10 years to make the game in X number of hours, you kind of can't have that be a factor as in terms of like doing that. But that's why I think sometimes, and this is still kind of in the same boat, where let's say you come down to your costs, like your in-kind costs or whatever your costs were to making that game. That's at the end of the day, that's kind of what you're basing it off of. Hey, if it cost me $80,000 to make the game, what is it going to take for me to make $80,000 so I can at the very least break even? Yeah. Mustapha and even Justin too, what you were talking about was like the value of the games and stuff, which what I thought was really interesting, like just like focusing on that aspect and stuff. And I think that's a key one. And actually, Mustapha, the analogy you provided, I think is a great one in terms of getting people in a different thing where it's like, hey, you could go out to any restaurant and let's say you drop $10 at a restaurant, like let's say McDonald's, not to call out McDonald's or anything, but you drop $10 at McDonald's. But if you drop, let's say like $40 or $50 at just some local place that's really nice and stuff, I mean, the time that it takes to like just enjoy yourself and everything or whatever else, I mean, you're probably going to get a lot more, and potentially the serving sizes might be a lot less for the type of food that you eat at the higher end place, but you're also probably going to enjoy that much more out of it. And is it going to be that much better of an experience because you spent that $50 and you got more quality food out of it? I mean, I think that's a really good way that just about everybody can relate to.
Mm-hmm. Right. And even then, right, like it's not a guarantee, right?
Exactly.
Like forking over the extra money definitely doesn't mean that you're going to have a better experience than you would at, say, a McDonald's. But the reality is that's just like a risk that you take as a consumer in general. And I just think the way that we think of games is so foreign because it's still, even after all this time, a medium that is very much like actively taking shape. Like it really, gaming is not in its final form, so to speak. It's ever changing.
I think Mustapha's right about about video games being kind of in their infancy, especially with indie games, because movies don't go through the same thing. Like they don't price movies based on how long the movie is or how good the movie is. Like you go to the movies, you pay $10 to get a movie ticket, and that's what you get. And then when they come out, they're all roughly the same price on Blu-ray or on DVD. And then they start discounting after they stop selling. Like those things are curated experiences, whereas indie games are not really. There's no method of curation really. You just kind of go on Steam and you're like, oh, there's a million different games out there. I think it's more. It's different than every other media. Like when CDs were a thing, you didn't pay by the quality of the CD. You just bought a $10 or $20 CD. And that was it.
And if you liked it, you'd buy it. Yeah. And that's really what it came down to. That's another good point too, because like, and if you think about it, because I know that like in the greater space and stuff of retail and everything else, or even just services and stuff, if you are discounting your product or service or whatever, there's potentially that perceived value that you are now devaluing your game or your product too.
Yeah. And
in a way, do you think that still kind of holds true? I mean, Dicky, what are your thoughts on that?
Based on just discounting your game to
Yeah.
I guess there's just so many factors that go into it. I think you have to play into account, like, is there certain games out there that are somewhat of competition, similar style, similar, gameplay? Do you want to kind of stay in head and toe with what they're doing for their pricing and stuff like that? You got to kind of play it by ear. You got to see what people are saying about your game in contrast or comparison to other games out there, because you don't want to like potentially lose people to those other games too. So,
but some indie games, the problem is that they don't have the outreach that companies like Epic has. Like Epic Games comes out with a game and everyone is all over it. But an indie game could come out that has the same or better quality, and then like it's tough to say like, oh, this is a $60 game and Epic Games is a $60 game. Trust us with your money, your $60, because we're an indie team. It's you can't really say that.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point too.
I mean, in my experience too, and I guess this is going to kind of sound like a plug for what you're already actively doing, right? But it's that I think indie games specifically have a real challenge with like I've been on so many Steam pages for games that I've played on other consoles and been like, wow, like this is one of the best gaming experiences I've ever had, but there's no way I would ever get that from looking at this page.
Oh yeah.
Like they fail to kind of capture what the actual like identity of that experience is, oftentimes in an effort to look closer to what other games are already doing. Yeah. Which I know is kind of a challenging thing to subvert, but I mean, even if you look at the likes of a game like Unravel, right? That's a kind of indie developed but AAA published game, and like I know for me personally, I probably seen that game at all if it hadn't been on like E3, and if EA hadn't been like pointing it out to everyone and saying, "Hey, check this game out." But like just kind of doing that research independently, like a lot of these game pages aren't necessarily they're already not doing a great job at indicating their value. And then when they're discounted, I assume, like as a consumer, I'm like, oh, this game must be on its last leg. It's probably not that great.
Yeah, there's a site called isthereanydeal.com, and there's another one, the steamdb.info page, that both show how discounted games have been. And it's tough to look at a game that's $20 that's been discounted 90% to $2 and say, I'm going to spend $20 on this game,
Yeah, because you kind of like set that boundary or set that like baseline. You're like, hey, here it's discounted this much, and then people are like, oh, well, I'll just wait for that crazy deal to come back,
yes.
or at least some type of deal to come back, or whatever. As we're probably getting a little bit close to like closing this and everything, one thing I wanted to discuss, and I think Justin touched upon this a little bit with his analogy with the films and stuff, is like, well, at least is there appropriate like strategy to discounting games that you guys think? Like, in my honest opinion, and kind of what I would said to this other Redditor the other day was, you know what, at launch, I don't think you should discount your game right away, because just see who it already is going to cater to. Get the people that buy that game at that price, I think, are going to be okay with it. Give it some time, develop a little bit more of a fan base and audience from that, the sales of that, and then make the determination later. I mean, so just in general, what do you guys think is a good strategy in terms of discounting? Because by no means, from my perspective, would I say no to discounting. If you don't have to, then that's awesome.
Yeah.
But what would be a good strategy, just in general?
I think I said this. I touched upon this in the first episode that we were on, where I said you have to appropriately look at your game, or not appropriately, but you have to look at your game as an outsider and say, is this game a quality experience? And that'll start you in the right track, I think, to determining whether or not you should discount and how to price it appropriately in the first place. Because if your game is garbage, then no amount of discounts are going to save a garbage game, and you're probably not, like, with there being so many games out there, your game is very unlikely to make much traction. But if your game's fantastic to begin with, maybe you don't need to drop it down that much. Like in the case of Cuphead, like I mentioned earlier, 15% was their discount, and I kept on looking, thinking, oh, I hope it goes on sale for 50% off because I'll totally buy it. And 15% was the most it got, and I think I ended up buying it anyways.
Yeah, I think one thing they have to, I was actually in kind of agreement with you, Andrew, what you were saying. Right when you start the game out, don't discount. Just see how things play out. I think you have to have some sense of pride in what you've created and what your price point is, and run with it for a while, see where it takes you. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's kind of double-edged swords, because some developers might be too proud of what they've created and kind of are blind to the fact that their game really isn't all that good. So you have to kind of let it play out, see how people react to it, and you can kind of react in terms of how they react to the game, and then justify potential discounts down the road. So,
Mustapha, what about you?
I might even say that if you're that early on thinking about discounting your game at launch, you probably want to re-examine your price point anyway.
Yep.
And then as a follow-up to that, I think I know it's kind of challenging, obviously, to compare the indie scene to the big titans, but I'd say I really like how Nintendo, for instance, does their discounts relative to specific things. Like, oh man, Inkling was announced for Smash Bros., so we're going to discount Splatoon so people know what that is. Mm-hmm. I think indie developers should really kind of aim to be more collaborative in that sense, even with other studios. Like I think a game like Brawlout, it was an independent fighting game that had characters from other studios, and maybe oh, this game just came out, it features our character, our game is discounted for this window of time so you can get to know the character better. Mm-hmm. Or things like that. Things that are kind of meta within the experience of the game that influence its cost. I think that creates a more engaging experience overall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So as we kind of come to a close here then, I don't even know what I would say in this too, but what would be the one thing you think we could just, from here on out, what we discuss, what we could offer to indie devs in terms of when it comes to either a strategy about or just discounting as a whole? What's one thing that you'd probably stand on the most?
Oh, geez.
I know it's a tough question.
I mean, I think they really need to sit back and think about what kind of game they're looking to create, what game they are currently creating, and really figure out their initial price point. From there, then you can start to play with different discounts down the road. But I think you really should just let it play out, see how far you can get with that price point. And I think they do need to kind of keep a pulse on games, similar games, and what Mustapha was talking about, doing some cross promotion. Maybe bringing in different